The romantic tragedy I'm working on continues to be a train wreck happening in slow motion, as we discussed in an earlier video. I've been struggling with this thing for a few weeks, so I decided it was time for a tried and true method writers use when met with a problem: procrastination. I cleaned my entire house, rearranged some furniture, and even cleaned my gutters, all in the hopes that the problem would somehow resolve itself. That obviously failed, so I decided to go the professional route, to take a more civilized approach when met with a problem I didn't know how to solve: research. Now, I'm admittedly not much of a romance guy. I don't really read the genre. That might be part of the problem. Over the past year, I have been building up some experience, mostly through catching up on old classic movies, things like The Shop Around the Corner and It Happened One Night. But for this research, I wanted to be more specific. I wanted to run the gamut of what the genre offered, looking at things both old and new. So I picked out 3 movies with the intention of sitting down and analyzing their structure, their characters, and what made them tick. The 3 movies I picked were When Harry Met Sally, one of the most successful and influential romantic comedies of all time; Before Sunrise, a critical darling focused on the philosophy of relationships; and In the Mood for Love, a dramatic, poetic mood piece. In this video, I'm not going to relitigate those movies, rather talking about what I learned from them. Lessons from the Screenplay has great videos on both When Harry Met Sally and the Before trilogy, and Nerdwriter has a really good video on In the Mood for Love. I'll link to all 3 below. I also discovered In the Mood for Love thanks to its amazing theme song, which bounces around YouTube from time to time, so I'll link to that too. Across all 3 movies, 2 lessons immediately presented themselves. The first is that, yeah, these stories are entirely dialogue. That seems obvious in retrospect. After all, these aren't action movies filled with car chases or superhero fights. But when you break it down, very little happens in the story except 2 characters having a conversation. Sometimes they talk while walking, sometimes they talk while sitting, but they're always talking. And the second is that it's just 2 people. There are very few characters in these stories. We typically only see 2 romantic leads, a best friend or confidant for each, and a smattering of background characters that get the occasional line of dialogue. One of my favorite directing choices from In the Mood for Love is how we never see the faces of the main characters' spouses. They are always just out of frame, out of focus for both the camera and the story. While answering some questions, this research raised another. If these stories are entirely dialogue and limited to only a few characters, how do the writers manage to keep that interesting? How do they turn it into an actual story? It was while doing this research I discovered a unique quirk of the romance genre, one that separates its structure apart from others. In a typical story, the writer keeps the audience engaged by adding conflict or tension to a scene. But in romance, we don't actually see that. Within each scene, there is very little conflict between the 2 characters. Even when disagreeing with one another, they are doing it from a place of mutual interest and attraction. Instead, the tension comes not from within the scene, but the pacing between them. And I can't really think of another genre that works that way. Horror maybe comes the closest that creation and building of suspense, but the romance genre employs them in a unique manner unto themselves. Romances achieve this unique pacing by employing 3 types of scenes, again and again throughout their structure. There's actually 4, but we're going to save that one for the end. These scenes aren't about dialogue or action or establishing shots. They aren't rising actions or falling actions. Instead, they can be broken down into anticipation, tension, and release. What you're physically doing in the scene, be it walking hand in hand or sitting down to a meal or rehearsing a play, is irrelevant. The only thing that matters to the scene from a structural perspective is which of these moods it evokes. We get anticipation scenes where we know that characters like one another, but won't commit to a course of action. We get scenes of tension where the characters walk a proverbial tightrope, where we clench up and wonder if they'll make it safely across. And we get scenes of release, relieving us from the tension, either because the characters have finally given in to their emotions, or because they've retreated to safety, deciding to live to fight another day. As interesting as these scenes can be on their own, It's the interplay between them that drives the story, that provides the dramatic tension. This is in some ways a microcosm of the three-act structure playing out over and over again throughout the story. The important thing to note is the structure isn't forming the story overall, and it isn't taking place within a singular individual scene. Instead, the structure is playing out between the scenes, linking them together like ropes in a bridge. The cycle, as it were, starts with anticipation. It's a special kind of tension that comes before an event rather than during. It's the slow squeezing of a spring applying pressure before it jumps. We see it when Harry and Sally are spending all of their time together while denying they have feelings for one another. We see it in the way Ethan Hawke looks at Julie Depley in Before Sunrise, and we see it in stairwell passings like Ships in the Night from In the Mood for Love. These are occasionally moments of anticipation for the characters, but more importantly, they're moments of anticipation for the audience. We've seen trailers, we know how stories work. We know these crazy kids are going to get together in the end. The only real question is how. So when these moments happen, we're left wondering, is this it? Is this the moment? Is this when sparks finally start to fly between them? Then comes tension proper. Scenes not of before or after, but of the present. These are the moments when the characters have taken that risk, when they've putting themselves out there, leaning in, exposed, and vulnerable. There's a terrific Imogen Heap song called Closing In that is all about this kind of tension. These are the scenes that cause us to worry, that make us question if the characters are going to screw it all up or if they'll stick the landing. And it's the type of scene where we see the most conflict between the characters. We see tension when Harry repeatedly says the wrong thing to Sally. We see it when Jesse makes an ass out of himself by dashing Celine's belief in magic and romance. And we see it in the palpable physical chemistry between Chow and Mrs. Chan from In the Mood for Love. The characters in these scenes are all taking some kind of risk. We feel them teetering on that edge, leaning farther and farther away from safety. Again, it is we, the audience, wondering if they'll make it. And in that tension, we find drama. And then there's the release. But release is not the same as victory. It's not even the same as resolution, which only comes at the end of a story. No, release in this instance is simply the relaxing of tension. It's the spring landing after a jump or air slowly being let out of a balloon. It can come in the form of a kiss atop a Ferris wheel, or when Harry and Sally roll out a carpet, comfortable in their role as platonic friends. It can come in the simple agreement to see one another again, or in the departure from a hotel room, even if we're unsure what transpired within. This release of tension is the exhale, and it's vital for the drama to work. Keeping the audience under pressure for too long diminishes the effect, leaving the audience either frustrated or bored. See basically every will they or won't they plot from sitcoms. As interesting as scenes of anticipation, tension, and release are, it's the interplay between them of how they relate to one another that matters. In When Harry Met Sally, for example, we get 3 basic scenes in a row. In the first, Harry and Sally bump into each other in the airport. They have a little conversation, there's some jokes, and so on. Fun, sure, but hardly groundbreaking. But this scene begins the cycle. It's our anticipation. Harry and Sally have not met each other for some time, and so we as an audience are on the edge of our seats, waiting to see how this interaction is going to play out. Then we get their conversation on the plane, the two of them being driven into conflict, creating tension between them. Then they use these interstitial interviews to release us from that tension. The cycle repeats not long after. We get an anticipation scene of Harry and Sally running into each other at the bookstore, a tension scene of the two of them talking, and then again the release provided by the interviews. Before Sunrise, and seemingly most romances, also use this same pattern. We get an anticipation scene with their conversation on the train, the tension when Jesse asks Celine to spend the day with him, and the release or relaxation of that tension when they get off the train together. Again, the cycle repeats. we have an anticipation scene where they ride in a car and talk about their past. As a side note, the conversation they have here is actually quite similar to a scene I wrote in Trial of Atlas, which was a fun little coincidence. Then we get a very tense scene, this time of physical tension, as they listen to music together. And the release scene comes when they arrive at the graveyard. Each of these cycles are composed of multiple scenes, each playing off the scene before it. So those are the three types of scenes: anticipation, tension, and release, that provide the fundamental structure for the romance genre. But isn't that how all stories work? This really is just a simplified 3-act structure. Anticipation is our Act 1, introducing us to the situation and what is at stake. Tension is the Act 2, the act of being tested or put into practice, challenged in some way. And release is our Act 3 falling action away from said tension. Or to think about it another way, it's setup, delivery, and payoff. The same structure jokes use as we talked about in the Do You Feel Lucky video. Using this 3-act structure within a scene isn't new to me. In fact, it's how I tend to outline my scenes, making sure they have a beginning, middle, and end unto themselves. I find this gives them a sense of flow and progression to feel satisfying before moving on to the next scene. What's interesting is how romance takes it one level higher up, zooming out to give the scenes a structure to slot into rather than within the scenes. It's effectively a middle space between the structure of a scene and the structure of an act, creating a unique movement, like the melody of a song being comprised of individual notes, but perceived as a singular entity. And the second reason this stuck out to me is because this is exactly how I write fight scenes. What is a fight scene if not anticipation, tension, and release? Two people standing off against one another, waiting to see who will move first. Again, we as the audience are held in just as much suspense as the characters. Then we get the simple but very real tension of the fight, of gunshots and lightsaber duels. We can't help but ask ourselves if the characters will get hurt or even die. It's the same thing in a romance, waiting to see who will take the first risky move, then bracing to see if they'll slip up, if they'll be shot down. The only difference is these mistakes are made with words, the injuries suffered to the human heart, rather than with guns or injury to the body. And in the end, we get a release. In a fight, that's usually because the bad guy was defeated or the good guy was killed. Happy or sad, it makes no difference. The tension is released either way. The conflict resolved, even if the resolution is only temporary. In romance, victory comes not from a fallen foe, but from a kiss or in a smile or a delicate touch. The characters aren't fighting with superpowers or weapons, but with words and beliefs. As the song goes, love is a battlefield. And that brings us rather neatly to philosophy. These movies are almost entirely dialogue. The characters spend the entire movie talking, and yet half the time they aren't talking to one another, but past each other. And the rest of the time, they're never really talking about the things they're saying. Confused yet? It's really noticeable in Before Sunrise, where Julie Depley's character will make a point, and Ethan Hunt is the Mission Impossible guy. Jesse will respond to Celine with a point that had nothing to do with what Celine was talking about, sometimes steering the conversation in an entirely different direction. Billy Crystal, as the titular Harry, is also quite guilty of this, though in Harry's case, the points tend to be more relevant, even in a roundabout way. For example, there's a scene in Before Sunrise where Jesse and Celine are approached by a fortune teller and have their palms read. Depley's character is moved by the poetry of the moment, of how beautiful it all is, while the cynical Jesse claims it's no more relevant than a newspaper horoscope, a grift to lure money away from tourists. On the surface, they're talking about the fortune teller, but really they're discussing their worldviews. Celine being a romantic who wants to believe in the magic of the world, and Jesse who knows there's a selfish motivation to everything. This is revisited later in the movie with a similar scene involving a poet that I really liked. This conversation within a conversation is one of the things we mean when we bring up subtext. But the romance genre specifically heavily relies on it. Nearly every conversation is one step removed, placed behind a smokescreen. It's why these movies can feel like two people aimlessly talking, debating, and philosophizing about innocuous subject matters. But each conversation is designed to bring them in conflict with one another and help the audience get to know them as individuals. This is how they keep the dialogue engaging through the story, changing subject and topic while still driving the ultimate narrative forward. This is the same technique action movies use, introducing new bad guys, new hurdles to present the characters with challenges they need to overcome. And there's one last secret the genre uses to tie this whole thing together, the fourth type of scene I hinted at earlier. More than any other genre I can think of, romances are given time to breathe, with scenes where the characters are allowed to silently exist with another person, neither advancing nor retreating, simply being in the space, enjoying the moment for what it is. We get scenes where the characters just sit somewhere or stare out over a sunset or find shelter in the rain, and in some ways, isn't this how we all fall in love in real life? Is it the dates and conversations that bring us together as couples? Or is it catching the glimpse of a crush across an office? Or fantasizing about someone seen on the subway? Or the comfortable silence of walking hand in hand down an empty street? These scenes are the inhales that come after the exhale, the break between the release and the anticipation. They quietly punctuate the action, providing a calm between the storms, and resetting the stage for the next cycle of anticipation, tension, and release. They help us to not only identify with these characters, but to empathize with them, to feel what they're feeling. These characters and their situations are all radically different. Harry and Sally are total opposites trying to make it in the big city. Jesse and Celine are two sides of the same coin, floating through the rivers of Vienna. Chow and Chan are nearly copies of one another, divided by circumstances and expectations. But from studying the genre, we can see that their story is the same, one of anticipation, tension, and release, permeating through the entirety of their works in ways both big and small. And we've learned that these things really are just long bouts of dialogue, even when they're talking about anything but the words leaving their lips. I guess that means I've got some more writing to do. I'm Mike Laguero. Thanks for watching. If you want to see how terrible of a writer I actually am, you can pick up my latest book, Thrice Dead Witch. It's a fun sword and sorcery tale set in the world of an epic fantasy I'm working on. And if you want to see my previous attempt at writing something even remotely akin to romance, consider picking up I'm Bored, a novella I wrote some time back, or you can pick up Trial of Atlas, the book I mentioned earlier. Every little bit helps. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next video. But to empathize.